stranger in the window. Elliot Grayson always felt secure in the stillness of his tiny, secluded home at the border of Willow Creek. The village was nothing more than a cluster of houses along a curving street, bounded by woods that absorbed sound. His home, a low-slung single-family dwelling with wide windows, overlooked the forest, with a vista of twisted trees and moving shadow. It was a place where a person could feel alone but secure, or at least until that autumn evening. He sat at his kitchen table, grading papers from his history class, the soft light of a single lamp illuminating a warm circle around his chair. It was a low murmur outside, a whisper of wind through trees that had become ordinary over time. The clock on his wall clicked past 9, and Elliot rubbed a sleep-heavy eye, his body fatigued from the day. He got up to pour a new cup of coffee before his gaze was diverted by a flash of movement outside his kitchen window. The window was wide, wood-framed, and stared into the dark yard. Elliot's hand hovered halfway to the coffee pot. There, on the other side of glass, was a figure. Too dark to identify features, yet unmistakable in silhouette. A tall, still man facing the direction of the house. Elliot's heart stuttered. He was alone in his living space, and guests rarely came, especially at a time as early as this. He squinted, attempted to identify features, but the figure was in shadow, a part of the darkness. He approached the window, his breath misting over the glass. The figure didn't stir. It was as though it was waiting, observing. Elliot's initial assumption was that it was a neighbor, either lost or disoriented, but no neighbors lived close enough to venture into his property by accident. He rapped upon the glass, a light tap, hoping the figure would respond. It didn't move. Apprehension crept into Elliot's chest. He switched on the porch light, hoping to light up the stranger. The bulb hummed, producing a feeble yellow light over the lawn, but the figure had disappeared. The vacant lawn gazed blankly at him, grass undulating in the breeze. Elliot scowled, his eyes raking over the trees. Had it been his imagination? He dismissed it, attributing it to exhaustion, turning off the light. But as he sat back to his papers, a certain unease remained, like a splinter under his skin. The next morning, Elliot awoke to a gray dawn, with clouds thick in the sky. He got up before departing for school, half hoping to find a set of footprints or any evidence of the stranger. The lawn was empty, the grass still damp with early morning dew. He arrived at school, where he taught, with only lesson plans and student queries breaking up his recollection of that moment. But by returning home in the evening, a recollection arrived. He prepared dinner, leaving the drapes open to see out into the yard. The woods that stretched behind his property tonight looked even darker, as if the trees leaned in closer. He dismissed it as nothing, telling himself that the apparition was a result of a shadow caused by a light. While he washed dishes, though, his gaze wandered to the window. The kitchen blurred in his reflection, and there it was, the shadow. This time, it was closer, standing outside in front of his porch, its form sharper in contrast to the blackness. Elliot dropped a plate, hearing its crash in the stillness of the house. He whirled to confront the window, his heart pounding. The figure remained stationary, its head tilted a little to one side as if watching him. The porch light was out, but in the gloom, Elliot could distinguish a figure in a long coat, a hat, details not visible the previous evening. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling over keys as he dialed the sheriff, but paused. What could he tell him? That a man stood in his yard, doing nothing? He walked toward the window cautiously, remaining at a distance. The quiet stillness of the figure was unnatural, as if sculptured from the blackness. Elliot's voice broke as he cried out, "Who's there? What do you want?" The sound remained in air, unspoken. He knocked loudly at the glass, but still, the figure didn't twitch. Then, slowly, it lifted a single hand, laying it against the air as if an invisible wall. The movement chilled Elliot's bones. He hurried backward, his mind reeling. He secured doors, checked the windows, and pulled in all of the shades in the house. The phone vibrated in his palm as he called Sheriff Harlan, who vowed to drive by. The sheriff phoned 60 minutes later, stating that no person was visible in the yard or in the woods outside. "Probably just a couple of kids fooling around," Harlan said, his voice dismissive. Elliot didn't disagree, but he knew it was no kids. Kids didn't stand like that, didn't freeze, or not freeze, like that. Sleep was elusive that evening. He was in bed, his ears listening to creaks in the house, to wind outside. Anything made him flinch, his gaze racing to the bedroom window, its curtains tightly shut. He kept reminding himself it was over, that the stranger was gone. But in his gut, he knew it wasn't. There was something lingering about the figure, a heavy, foreboding presence, as if a storm was brewing to break. As he slipped into fitful sleep, a sound cut through the quiet, a soft tap, a finger against glass. It was from the living room window. Elliot's eyes opened, his heart racing. He didn't shift, didn't breathe, waiting for the sound to happen once more. It didn't. But in the silence that came afterward was fear, thick with the feeling that it was still out here, watching, waiting for him to turn around. Elliot awoke to the rhythm of rain pounding against the roof, a steady beat which didn't help to ease his tension. The image of tapping at the window lingered with him, vivid and sharp. He hadn't gone to check the living room last night, hadn't wanted to confront what might have waited. And now, in pale morning light, he steeled himself to check over the house. The windows were secure, their curtains untroubled, and the garden outside was deserted, shiny with rain. No prints, no sign of breaking in. But still, a feeling of unease lingered, a pressure in his chest which intensified with each passing moment. At school, Elliot found it hard to concentrate. His students knew it, their murmurs trailing after him as he stumbled through a lecture on the Civil War. At lunch, he spoke to Margaret, the school librarian, who lived a few miles outside Willow Creek. She listened, furrowing her brow, as he told her about the figure in the window. "Might have been a drifter," she said. "Or perhaps your eyes are deceiving you. You live out there by yourself, Elliot. The mind can conjure up things in the dark." Her words, intended to soothe, instead intensified his uncertainty. He knew what he'd witnessed. The apparition wasn't a trick of light, a product of his imagination. It was too solid, too intentional. That night, as he left for home, he stopped at the hardware store and purchased motion-sensitive lights and a new deadbolt for his front door. If the stranger came calling, he'd be prepared. He put up the lights as darkness began to close in, their beams slashing through shadow. The yard was transformed in their hard light, trees stretching out in sharp-edged blackness that writhed in the breeze. Elliot experimented with the sensors, flapping his arms until lights came to life, confident they'd pick up anything. Indoors, he double-checked doors, keeping a flashlight in his jacket, its presence a tiny comfort. Supper was a quick affair, a sandwich wolfed down at the counter. He skirted around the windows, but the desire to glance was overpowering, a tingling that could not be stilled. Finally, he opened the kitchen curtains, only a crack, and looked outside. The yard was uninhabited, lights dark. He let out a breath, relief tangled with shame. Perchance Margaret was correct. Perchance he was making a big deal out of it. And as he whirled around, the motion sensors went off, illuminating the yard. Elliot spun about, his heart racing. There, at the brink of the light, was the figure. It was closer than it was before, only beyond the porch steps, its coat billowing a little. The brim of its hat hid its face, but Elliot could feel its eyes, hard as stone, piercing through glass. He pulled shut the curtains, his hands shaking. The lights outside remained lit, their beams peeping over the drapes. He snatched up the phone, calling Sheriff Harlan a second time, his voice shaking as he told his description. "It's back," he said. "It's closer this time." Another patrol was assured by Harlan, but his voice held the same doubt as before. Elliot threw up his hands in frustration, slamming down the phone. Nobody was coming to rescue him, not in time. He paced in the kitchen, holding the flashlight as a weapon. The outside lights began to flash, then died, leaving the yard dark. Elliot came to a stop, his head cocked, listening. The rain ceased, leaving only choking silence. Then, a sound, a drawn-out, calculated scrape, as if moving along the porch. It ceased, replaced only by a slight creak, as though a load shifted upon the boards. Elliot's breath froze. He moved quietly to the living room, where the big window looked out over the porch. The drapes were shut, but a thin crack allowed a glimpse of the outside. He didn't want to see, but he needed to. He gingerly pushed aside the curtain with shaking fingers. The figure was close, tapping on the glass, still hidden behind the hat. But now, Elliot could glimpse its hands, pale, abnormally long, with fingers that curled at incorrect angles, pressed against the glass. He took a step backward, a gasp escaping his mouth. The figure did not shift, but its presence filled the air, a chill, stifling weight that made the air thick. His mind spun. This was no man. No man stood in such a posture, no man had hands in such a way. He dashed to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him, though he knew better. Whatever was out there was not limited by doors, by locks. He sat down on the bed, the beam of light sweeping over the walls. The house was quiet, yet quietness was a living thing, aware of his presence. He considered calling Margaret, or getting in his car to drive to town, but to open a front door, to venture out into darkness, was impossible. He was a prisoner, and the stranger was aware of it. Time passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was a blur in the throes of fear. Then, a new noise cut through silence. A low, throaty hum, a voice but not a voice, from the living room. It was not human, not quite. Elliot's skin crawled, his head racing with visions of the figure's hands, its obscured face. The hum deepened, resonating through walls, and with it came a conviction. The stranger wasn't simply observing any longer. It was waiting, and Elliot was short of time. Elliot didn't sleep. The hum ceased some time before daybreak, replaced by a hush that was even more unbearable. He sat up against the wall in the bedroom, the battery in the flashlight having gone dark hours ago. The house was no longer the same, as if the presence of the stranger in it had penetrated the walls, polluting the air. He couldn't erase his mind's eye vision of those hands, their unhuman length, their distorted joints, against the glass. Whatever was beyond was not human, and it was approaching. Morning provided no respite. The sky was a dull gray, a mist covering the outside woods. Elliot searched the house with a hasty pace, not wanting to stay close to the windows. The living room window was unmarred, unsmudged by those white hands, but lack of evidence only intensified his fear. He called in sick to his job, not able to handle the outside world. The notion of stepping outside the house, of driving by the woods where the stranger could await, was unendurable. He spent the day searching, combing the internet for anything which could possibly account for what he'd witnessed. Willow Creek was a place with no history of hauntings, no folklore about ghosts in the woods. He discovered accounts of shadowy people and doppelgangers, yet none of them fit the stranger's purposeful, malevolent presence. Exasperation and fear had worn down his nerves by afternoon. He needed someone to say to him that he wasn't losing his mind. He phoned Margaret. who said she'd come over after her shift. When she got there, her matter-of-fact attitude was a salvation. She examined the yard, the windows, the new lights, her light piercing the deepening shadows. "Nothing here, Elliot," she told him, her tone resolute. "No tracks, no evidence of anybody. Are you certain you're not just tense? Teaching's difficult, staying alone out here can get to you." Elliot wished to believe her, but her memory of the stranger's hands was too sharp. He pointed to the living room window, telling her of the figure's proximity, of the buzz that filled the house. Margaret listened, her face softening. "Perhaps it's time to step away from it," she said. "Stay with me in town for a few days. Get some perspective." He waited, but to leave his home was to surrender. Whatever it was, it had selected him, his residence. Flight could only put it off. He thanked Margaret, assuring her that he'd call if anything else came up. She departed as twilight approached, her car's taillights diminishing into blackness. By himself, Elliot barricaded the house. He pounded boards over the living room window, the sound of his hammer booming in the stillness. The other windows he covered with blankets, shuttling out the darkness. The motion sensor lights remained on, softened by their covering. He was more secure, though not secure. The stranger remained outside, and board up only confined him to his fear. Night descended, along with a crushing stillness. Elliot remained seated at his kitchen table, a knife resting in front of him, blade shining in the lamplight. He neither slept, nor eaten, his adrenaline-coated body straining to hold still. The creaks of his house sounded like threats, magnified. He sat, his gaze fixed upon draped-over windows, his heart straining to hear a sign, a sound, anything. It arrived a little after midnight, a low scratching, sounding like wood and nails, from the living room. Elliot's breath caught. He clamped his fists around the knife, his knuckles bleaching. The scratching increased, rhythmic, forceful, as though a presence was probing the boards he'd put up. He ached to cry out, to make it go away, but his voice wasn't there. The air was getting colder, his lamp bulb pulsating as the scratching became a low, steady scrape. He moved to the living room, his fist gripping the blade. The boards covering the window remained in place, but the scarring was undeniable, from beyond. Then, a different sound, a whisper, not language but a sharp hissing, like air moving through dry leaves. It was close, much too close, as if the stranger's face was pressed up against wood, its breath escaping through gaps. Elliot stepped back, his heart racing. The hiss intensified, taking on forms that, though not words, possessed significance, a wicked intent that repulsed his skin. He made a dash for his bedroom, locking the door, aware that it was pointless. The house was no longer his. The stranger owned it now, and he was a trespasser in his own haven. He sat against the bed, the useless knife clutched in his lap. The hissing ceased, but silence was worse, charged with expectation. Then, a new sound, a slow, heavy knock, not at the window but at the front door. One, then another, each progressively harder, as though testing the strength of doors. Elliot's mind screamed for him to flee, to hide, but there was nowhere to escape. The knocks came, steady, constant, and with each, he felt the presence of the stranger increase, its shadow spreading over the house, reaching towards him. The knocking ceased as suddenly as it started, leaving Elliot stock-still, his sweat-wet knife still clutched in his grasp. The silence was a living presence, a heavy thing that weighed upon him, waiting. He didn't breathe, didn't stir, listening in silent fear for any sound of the stranger. Hour upon interminable minute ticked by, then still no sound came from indoors. The first light of dawn filtered through in the gaps in the blankets, a pale, unhelpful gray. Elliot felt his body tense with pain, his mind racked with exhaustion. He knew he could not remain in such a state, hiding in his own house, pursued by a force outside his grasp. He willed himself to behave. He examined the front door, half expecting to see that it was splintered or scratched, but it was unbroken, the new deadbolt in place. The living room window boards remained in place, the blankets over the other windows still. The outdoor lights, which required a movement to activate, were dark, their new batteries depleted. The lack of evidence was infuriating, as if the stranger was only a product of his imagination, but its existence was irrefutable. Elliot phoned Margaret, his throat rough. He described to her the knocking, the hissing, the feeling that the stranger was no longer only a presence outside but, in some way, in the air that filled his lungs. This time, she didn't refuse. "I'm coming over," she said. "And I'm bringing Father Daniel." Elliot wasn't a believing man, but any presence that could help was a lifeline that, no matter his reservations, he could not reject. Margaret came in with Father Daniel, a spindly sort of fellow with a kind-faced expression and a quiet air. Father Daniel listened to Elliot, his head nodding, his crucifix shining in the dim light. "There are things in this world which we don't comprehend," he said. "Not ghosts, not demons, but something more. It thrives on fear, on loneliness. If this is what you have to deal with, then we have to deal with it, not hide from it." They made their way through the house, Father Daniel sprinkling holy water as he spoke prayers. Elliot was behind, holding the knife, his gaze skipping to hidden windows. The words of the priest were firm, though they brought little comfort to the knot of fear twisted in Elliot's gut. When they came to stand in the living room, Father Daniel stopped, his hand resting over the plywood-covered window. "This is where it's most concentrated," he spoke, his tone low. "Whatever it is, it's connected to here, to you." He offered a blessing, a ritual to purify the house. Elliot assented, grasping at anything that could possibly save her. Candles were lit, their light dancing in the stagnant air, and Father Daniel started to chant, his voice swelling and receding. Margaret remained beside Elliot, her grasp upon his arm, her solidity anchoring him. For an instant, it seemed possible, as if the burden in the house was subsiding. The candles then burned out, all in a moment, making the room dark. The air chilled, dropping in temperature so abruptly that Elliot's breath missed it. Father Daniel's incantation stuttered, and Margaret gave a gasp, her hold tightening. There emerged a sound from outside the window, a low, guttural laugh, not human but derisive, creeping in through the boards. The covers over the other windows stirred, as though some presence was brushing against them, probing their hold. "Stay together," Father Daniel instructed, his tone firm in contrast to the fear bathing his eyes. He relit a candle, its light dull and shaking. The laugh was louder, a guffaw, followed by a scraping, a sound of claws over glass, at each window in the house. Elliot's heart pounded, his mind shouting that they'd only made it worse, that the stranger was now enraged, angered by their resistance. The scraping ceased, replaced by a single, earth-shaking bang at the front door. The house creaked, dust drifting from the ceiling. Margaret screamed, and Father Daniel held up his crucifix, yelling a prayer. The bang came a second time, then a third, louder, as if the door was giving way. Elliot dropped the knife, his hands immobile, his body transfixed by knowing that they were in danger from the stranger. And then there was silence. The air grew warm, the candles steadying. Father Daniel concluded his prayer, his voice trembling. "Gone," he said, but was not sure. "For now." He told Elliot to depart, to wait in town until they got more information. Elliot nodded, too tired to protest. He packed a small bag, and they rode to Margaret's, the woods whizzing by, their shadows concealing what lurked. At Margaret's, that evening, Elliot was awake. The guest room was still, shades drawn, yet he could feel the stranger's eyes, even there. He remained awake, his gaze riveted to the ceiling, until a creak shattered the silence. A light tap, a tap of a finger against glass, from the opposite window. His blood turned icy. He didn't glance, didn't shift, but knew it was there, tracking him, its existence a shadow that no prayer could dispel. Elliot didn't mention the tap at her window to Margaret. He couldn't bear to pull her in deeper, to confess that the stranger tailed him. The next morning, he sat at her kitchen table, his eyes empty, as she brewed coffee. Father Daniel came in, his face etched with concern. They spoke of possibilities, additional blessings, documents, even relocation, but Elliot knew none of it would suffice. The stranger wasn't limited by location or ceremony. It was tied to him, and it wasn't complete. Father Daniel proposed that they go back to the house, to confront the stranger on his own turf. "It's more potent because you're fearful," he said. "If you confront it, let it see you're not alone, it could subside." Elliot wasn't sure, but remaining hidden was a kind of defeat. He agreed, out of a desperate desire to have done with it, to have his life restored to him. They returned to Willow Creek, its trees looming under a battered sky. The house was smaller, its windows darkened despite the removal of blankets, Margaret having taken them, believing light to be a remedy. Inside, air was thick, silence heavy with expectation. Father Daniel began a blessing, a third time, with salt and sage, as Margaret remained by Elliot's side, her presence a tenuous counterweight. They started in the living room, Father Daniel's voice firm as he sprinkled salt. Elliot clamped his fingers around a candle, its light quivering in his hold. The house was silent, far too silent, as if it was holding its breath. Then, a sound, a low hum, similar to before, but lower, reverberating in Elliot's bones. The candle quivered, a chill spreading in the air, the temperature dropping. "It's here," Father Daniel breathed. The hum grew to a growl, filling the air, and the living room windows shook, the boards creaking as if strained. Margaret grabbed Elliot's arm, her eyes wide. The growl took on words, unspoken but palpable, a demand to gaze, to behold. Elliot's eyes looked toward the window, though all his instincts cried to turn away. The boards splintered apart, a slow, measured crack that sounded like gunfire. On the other side of the gap, the stranger, its hat missing, stood exposed, its face for the first time. It was no face, but a void, a whirling blackness where there should have been features, with two glowing points resembling eyes, blazing with evil hunger. Its hands, those gnarled, pale hands, clawed at the air, reaching through gaps in the splintered boards. Father Daniel cried out, brandishing his crucifix, but the stranger's presence filled the room, a blast of icy air that blew out the candle. Margaret screamed, dragging Elliot with her, but he was transfixed. The stranger's gaze pinned him, stripping away his mind, his memories, until he was dissolving, merging with the void. "Elliot, struggle!" Margaret's voice cut in, urgent and desperate. He grasped for it, for her, closing his eyes. Father Daniel's prayers increased, a battle cry over the snarl. The presence of the stranger bore down, the air charged with its fury, but Elliot gripped on, his attention clinging to Margaret's hand, to her warmth. The growling reached its peak, a shaking of the house, then ceased. The chill receded, air clearing. Elliot's eyes opened. The window remained in place, boards unbroken, as if nothing at all had occurred. The stranger was no more, but its disappearance was not a defeat, only a retreat. Father Daniel leaned back, spent. "Not yet, though," he said. "This is connected to you, Elliot. You have to go, make a new start somewhere else." Elliot agreed, too spent to protest. He gathered up what remained, and they departed, the house receding in the mirror, its windows darkened and vacant. Weeks afterward, Elliot found a new town, a tiny apartment outside Willow Creek. He attempted to rebuild to forget, but the stranger's eyes haunted him, shining in his dreams. He avoided windows, kept curtains drawn, yet the sensation of watching always lingered. One evening, as he sat reading, a sound interrupted the quiet, a tap, light but unmistakable, from the only window of his apartment. He didn't want to. He knew what he'd find. The stranger was eternal, patient, and it would wait. Elliot shut his eyes, the sound of water getting closer, and knew there was no way out. The window was all around, and the stranger was always in reach, just behind the glass, waiting for a glimpse. The tapes of tomorrow. Elliot Harper was captivated by things that had been forgotten. The thrift store at Maple Street, with its clogged aisles and sparse shelves, was his sanctuary. On a cool autumn evening, he strolled in, his breath misty in the sharp air. The bell over the door tinkled softly, and the store owner, a bespectacled old man, acknowledged his presence with a nod, not looking up from his paper. Elliot's hand ran over broken teacups and faded books until his fingers came upon a corner stacked high with electronics, their wires snaking together like vines. There, half hidden beneath a battered radio, was an ancient video player. The black plastic exterior was scratched, with a faded brand name no longer visible, only a dull impression of a few letters. Next to it was a pile of unmarked VHS tapes, blank except for smudges of dust. Elliot's curiosity was piqued. He hadn't laid eyes on a VHS player since childhood, and the nostalgia tugged at him. $10 for the set was what the price tag said. He wavered, then lugged player and tapes to the counter. He placed the player in his living room, its weight denting his coffee table. There was no room to get away from it, his apartment a squat, peeling walled affair with only a single window to a busy street. He hooked up the player to his old TV, one of those with knobs instead of a remote, and inserted tape number 1. It crackled to life, then cleared to show a grainy image of his apartment, but not his. The furniture was okay, but the walls were streaked with black stains, and there was a heavy, smoky feel to it. Someone moved into frame, Elliot, or an Elliot. His eyes sunk deep in his skull, his skin stretched over his cheeks, his walk a jittery, over-the-shoulder look. Elliot inched closer, his heart pounding. The tape depicted him seated at his kitchen table, but his table was cluttered with papers, maps, and photos, none belonging to him. The other Elliot wrote frantically, tussling over words the muffled sound of which was inaudible to the tape. Suddenly, a shadow crossed over the window in the background, moving too swiftly to make out. The other Elliot stopped in his tracks, pen falling from his hand, and the screen filled with static. Elliot ejected the tape, his hands shaking. He checked out the window, nothing but passing cars and streetlights. The tape was blank, no date, but it depicted his apartment, his face. He pressed in another tape. This tape opened in a park he knew, a place in his hometown with a pond where a dozen or more ducks swam. The sky was streaked with storm clouds, and the other Elliot was by the water, wearing a backpack. The woman came up to him, her face blurry as if smudged by an invisible finger. She gave him something hard, shining, and the other Elliot flinched, shaking his head. The blurred woman's face contorted, and the tape cut off. Sleep escaped Elliot that evening. He reclined on his couch. Looming in front of him was the video player. The tapes pulsed with a life of their own, observing him as closely as he was observing them. By morning, his mind told him it was a joke, some sort of elaborate art installation left behind at the thrift store. But the specifics, the color of his couch, the crack in his kitchen tile, were too accurate. He phoned his friend Marcus, an electronics hobbyist who tinkered with old electronics. Marcus came over, toolkit jangling. He eyed the player, whistling. "This thing's old," he said. "Must have been in the late 80s. He couldn't account for the tapes, however. The video wasn't digital, he said, but analog, recorded in real time to the VHS. No editing or CGI effects. Marcus recommended documenting what Elliot experienced, to see if there was a pattern. He departed, saying that he'd investigate where the player came from. By himself, Elliot played a third tape. This featured him in an unfamiliar location, a cramped, fluorescent-lit hallway. The other Elliot ran, his breathing strained, holding a blade. Blood streaked his fingers, though whose, Elliot was not able to determine. Something chased after him, a figure, human but distorted, its limbs lengthened, its motions spasmodic. The tape terminated as the figure lunged. Elliot's gut was roiling. He jotted down the scenes in a notebook, as advised by Marcus, but it was a pointless exercise. These were not random scenes, but his own existence distorted into horrors. He searched the player's casing for any clues, discovering only a tiny etching, property of L. Marrow. The name didn't mean anything, but it chilled him. He went back to the thrift store that evening, hoping that perhaps the owner of the store was aware. The store was dark, its windows black, but a sign on the door said, "Out of town until November." The image reflected in glass from Elliot was pale, like the other Elliot from tapes. The tapes clanked in his passenger seat as he drove home. In his apartment, he sat in front of the player, deciding whether to watch one more. The tapes were a jigsaw, but each new piece was worse than the last. But still, he couldn't stop. He needed to understand why they were there, who they made, and why they showed him. When his finger extended to grab the next tape, his phone beeped, a text from nowhere, "Stop watching." He paused, his finger over the play icon. The text came with no sender, no preamble. He typed a return, "Who is this?" But it didn't go through, the screen flashing in error. Elliot's eyes wandered to the player. It was still, its power light pulsing softly, like an eye. He ached to destroy it, to destroy the tapes, but a part of his soul, his love of forgotten objects, impelled him onward. The tapes didn't only depict his past, they depicted his future. And that future, he recognized with a sinking despair, was drawing near. Elliot didn't sleep. The text message, "Stop watching," seared itself in his mind, its anonymous threat playing like a sour song. He turned off the video player, jammed it in a closet, and piled the tapes in a box at his feet, hidden under his bed. But the apartment was different now, as though the presence of the tapes lingered. The light was harder, and any creak of wood in the floors made his heart skip a beat. By morning, his eyes were bloodshot, his coffee tasting bitter like ash. He phoned Marcus a second time, leaving a message about the text. Marcus didn't respond, a not uncommon occurrence. Marcus got lost in his projects for days. Elliot attempted a third time at the thrift store, but still, the closed sign remained in the window. Frantic to find answers, Elliot searched online for L. Marrow, the player's name engraved in it. The findings were minimal, a few death notices, a law firm in Ohio, nothing related. He entered Video Player Foretells Future into the search bar, half hoping to find a sea of conspiracy theories, instead discovering only technology reviews and film tropes. The tapes remained a hidden anomaly, a subject which the internet hadn't touched. At noon, Elliot's determination weakened. He pulled out the player. It's bulkier than he recalled. He assured himself he'd watch one more tape, to comprehend. He selected the fourth, its case warped a little, as though it had been exposed to warmth. The screen hesitated, then displayed his apartment once more, but walls were bare, no furniture in sight. The other Elliot was in the middle, holding a light. The light swept across the room, showing symbols etched in walls, spirals, crude lines, forms that ached to gaze upon. The other Elliot's lips moved in a silent chant, though his sound was a low murmur. On the street, there was silence, city lights out. A single knock came upon the tape, sharp, purposeful. The other Elliot turned, his flashlight trembling. The door creaked open, to nothing but black. Then a pale, skeleton-like hand emerged from out of nowhere, nails extending like claws. The tape cut off, the screen dropping to black. Elliot's actual door was on the other side of the room, but he checked it anyway, his heart pounding. He scribbled them down in his notebook, his handwriting unsteady. The tapes weren't random, they were in order, each scene more desolate than the previous. The first was of him worried, the second desperate, the third pursued. This one was final, a grave. He didn't know if the tapes were warnings or fates. The text message hinted someone knew of them, someone who was telling him to slow down. But who? The shopkeeper? El Mero? The blurred woman in the park? Elliot's phone buzzed, jolting him. Another text from that unknown number. You watched again. His gut plummeted. He typed, involuntarily, "Who are you? What do you want?" This time, the text sent, but no answer was forthcoming. He paced, the tapes glaring from the table. He debated ripping them apart, but it felt somehow wrong, as if to destroy a diary. They belonged to him, in a way that eluded him. He went to Marcus's place, a messy bungalow on the outskirts of town. There was Marcus's car in the drive, but no one was home. He looked in a window, viewing only darkness and piles of circuit boards. He phoned Marcus's number, hearing it ring from inside, unattended. Anxiety draped itself over him like cool fog. Marcus was his lone friend in all of this, and now that he was unavailable. At home, Elliot discovered a package on his doorstep, a plain brown envelope with no label. It contained a single VHS tape, unmarked, case still in pristine condition. His hands trembled as he held it. This was not one of the original pile. Someone had left it in his absence. He hesitated, then slipped it into the player. The screen was a street at night, rain gleamed empty. The other Elliot trudged, hood up, carrying the same backpack from the park tape. He approached a building, its sign incomprehensible. The camera followed, jerky, as if it was carried by a human. Inside, the other Elliot stood in front of a mirror, his reflection distorted, eyes bulging, mouth stretched. The reflection spoke in a hissing voice, "You can't run." The tape ended. Elliot pulled it out, his breathing shallow. The tapes were no longer foretelling. They were invasions. Something or someone was watching him, leaving new tapes, sending messages. He looked at his phone. No new messages, but the power was running low, though it was full that morning. He charged it, but then the screen flashed, giving a momentary display of static, like the tapes. He sat down on the couch, tape in his lap. The apartment was far too quiet, air heavy. He needed to call the police, but what could he tell them? That he'd discovered magical tapes foretelling his demise? They'd think him mad. He even thought about leaving, getting in his car and driving far, far away, but the tapes had been delivered to his apartment. What if they came with? At twilight, the electricity flashed. Elliot stopped, his head cocked. There was a low hum in the closet, where he'd left the player. The closet creaked open, and the power light from the player glowed, though it was not plugged in. The hum intensified, more like a voice, muttering words that made no sense. He shut the closet, his heart pounding. The tapes weren't only projecting his future, now they were dictating it. Elliot hadn't handled the tapes in 2 days, but they plagued him. The player, which was once more in the closet, hummed at night, though he was certain it was not plugged in. The new tape, which was delivered to his house, rested upon his coffee table, its blank box taunting him to watch. He steered clear of it, instead turning to normalcy, work, milk from the store, anything to avoid drowning in fear. Normalcy, however, was tenuous, a crack in a glass, waiting to splinter. While working in his office job, typing in spreadsheets, Elliot's mind strayed. His colleagues commented, inquiring if he was fine. He muttered half-hearted excuses, not meeting their gaze. Over lunch, Elliot searched for Marcus online, discovering nothing, no social media posts, no reports. He dialed Marcus's phone number once more, but it went straight to voicemail. On impulse, Elliot visited Marcus's residence after leaving his office. The car remained parked there, lights off. This time, Elliot knocked louder, then attempted to open the door. It was unlocked. Inside, stale air thick with solder smoke and dust filled his lungs. Marcus's tools spilled from his bag, covering the floor, and his laptop, with its screen black, rested open. Elliot's call echoed. On the coffee table in the living room, a notebook, its contents filled with Marcus's handwriting, waited for him. VHS anomalies, temporal distortion, L. Marrow, cult? He felt a chill. Marcus had been working on the player, and now he was missing. Elliot slipped the notebook in his pocket, and, with a feeling of being watched, headed out. At home, his apartment was colder. The new tape remained on his table, unused. He rifled through Marcus's notebook, discovering diagrams of the player's circuits and a set of cryptic annotations. Tapes remake reality. Source unknown. Be careful. One phrase was underlined, they see you. Elliot's skin tingled. He looked at his phone, nothing new, but his battery died, though it was fully charged. He connected it, and his screen pulsed with static briefly. Unable to help himself, Elliot inserted the new tape. On the screen was a forest, thick with trees and moonlight. The other Elliot was running, breaking branches underfoot. His was a bruised face, his eyes swollen shut. He had a flashlight, its beam sickly. Something was moving in the trees, a shadow with too many arms. The other Elliot tripped, collapsing into a clearing. The shadow towered, its shape writhing like poor reception. The tape cut off in a scream, nothing his, but a scream, inhuman. Elliot's hands trembled as he ejected the tape. The woods didn't seem familiar, but fear was familiar. He wrote down the scene in his notebook, spotting a pattern. With each tape, the other Elliot was driven further into despair, into destruction. He wondered whether or not viewing the tapes made them actual, like opening a door. The messages, "Stop watching, you watched again," were evidence. Someone, or something, was monitoring his behavior. A creak woke him up that night, a light scratching, a sound of fingernails against wood. It was coming from his closet. He took a kitchen knife, his heart racing, and opened the closet. The player was still, light gone. But scratching persisted, now in the walls. He pressed his head to the wall, hearing whispers, too quiet to make out. The air thickened, light fading as if Tyrese, he spoke, calling a colleague who'd been strange, always sneaking looks at him. Elliot closed the closet, locking it, though he knew locks would not serve. The next day, he returned to the thrift store. The sign saying they were closed was gone, but the store was vacant, the shelves empty. The new store owner, a female, reported that the old owner ran off in a hurry, leaving no forwarding information. She didn't have any information about the player or L. Marrow. Elliot departed, feeling as if the world was crushing in. At his place, he discovered yet another package, a second new tape, its container similar to the first. He didn't want to watch, yet his hands acted of their own accord, fitting it into the player. This tape depicted his apartment, but walls blanketed with the same symbols from tape 4, spirals, zigzag lines. The other Elliot sat on the floor surrounded by candles, chanting. His voice was raw, his fingers bleeding as he etched a symbol into wood. The air rippled, and a figure materialized, not shadow, but blurred woman from the park. For a moment, her face came into sharp focus, her eyes like voids. She stretched toward him, and the tape cut to static. Elliot ripped out the tape, his breathing rough. The woman was no longer human. He snatched up Marcus's notebook, rereading the reference to the cult. Was Marrow a person, a faction, or worse? He searched his apartment for the symbols. The walls, however, remained blank, but beneath his sofa was a single spiral, newly carved. It wasn't his. He moved away, still holding the knife. The phone buzzed in his hand. You can't hide. He hurled it at the wall, the screen splintering. The lights pulsed, and the player whirred, louder, a voice inside it reciting his name. Elliot collapsed to the ground, his tape spilling from his hands. It wasn't that they were foretelling his future. It was dragging him in, frame by frame. Elliot's apartment was no longer his. The spiral, which had emerged from under the couch, extended, the faint lines now etched into walls, floors, even ceiling, making patterns that pulsed whenever his back was turned. He'd not slept in days, getting by on fear and coffee. The video player, still shut in the closet, whirred continuously, its voice louder now, whispering his name, his mind, his secrets. The tapes, new and old, rested in a pile, their covers shining like newly polished bones. He'd stopped reporting to his job. His boss left messages, then quit calling. His colleagues, including Tyrese, had always been aloof, but Elliot now wondered if they were in on it, whatever it was. Marcus's notebook provided no solutions, only puzzles. Tapes are conduits. Reality warps. Marrow holds the key. Elliot searched the name more, going deeper into shadowy forums. He discovered a single thread, deep in a now-defunct bulletin board. Marrow, 1987, disappeared after VHS experiments. No information, no updated thread. It was enough to substantiate his worst fear. The player wasn't obsolete technology. It was more taking people. Elliot attempted to escape. He packed his bag, snatched his keys, ended up in the parking lot. But his car was unresponsive, its engine quiet with a full gas tank. His phone, cracked though still working, displayed a new message. Where are you going? He dropped his keys, looking around. There was no one in sight though, yet the air was tense, aware. He sprinted inside, locking the door, aware that it was pointless. The new tape, the second that arrived at his door, burnt in his mind. He hadn't reopened it since, but in his mind's eye, its images, the blurred woman, void eyes, stuck. He needed to make sense of it, to strike back. Marcus's notebook spoke of a ritual, a half-scrawled diagram marked reversal. It used symbols, candles, and blood. Elliot winced, but stockpiled supplies, candles from a drawer, a lighter, his kitchen blade. He copied the symbols from the notebook to the floor, replicating their curves meticulously. His hands trembled, but hurried by in his mind was the whine of the closet. He ignited the candles, their flames dancing in shadow, curving against light. He sat in the circle, a knife in his lap. The notebook instructed to say the words, but there were no words. Elliot shut his eyes, remembering other Elliot's chants from tape. He delicately whispered, "Let me go," over and over, his voice breaking. The air thickened, the flames dying down. He cut his palm, his wincing as blood dripped onto symbols. The hum ceased, silence closing in, choking. The player clicked, its power light shining. The closet creaked open, though he'd locked it. The knife was gripped by Elliot, his blood spreading on the floor. The TV was still, with no tape, but his apartment, live, with him in the circle. The angle was high, impossible, Yet there was no camera. The blurred female came up behind him, her face clear now, her skin gray, eyes black. She smiled, her mouth stretched wide. "You called," she said, her voice in the room, not from the speakers. Elliot screamed, striking out at the air, but she was gone. The TV screen was black, and the candles died. He leaped to his feet, his knife falling from his fingers. The symbols on the floor pulsed softly, then died. The ritual had accomplished something, but not what he'd expected. The hum began to sound again, louder, taunting. He picked up the new tape, hoping against hope for clues, and crammed it into the player. The screen reflected a damp, box-strewn cellar. The other Elliot crouched, tapes stacked around him, hundreds, a shrine. He was older, his hair gray, his face etched with scars. He clutched a tape, talking to it. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The blurred woman crouched behind him, her hand resting upon his shoulder. She leaned in, whispering, and the other Elliot cried. The door to the cellar creaked open, and from it stepped the shadow from the woods tape, its figure more distinct now, tall, gaunt, with static-like eyes. The tape ran out. Elliot vomited, bile scalding his throat. The tapes weren't his future, they were a trap, a loop. The other Elliot wasn't his. He was what Elliot would grow into. He scoured the apartment, ripping open closets, searching for a basement door. There wasn't any, but the symbols reappeared, deeper, cut into walls. He hadn't done it. He took up Marcus's notebook, rereading the ritual. Something in the margin, in alternate ink, "Blood binds you. Destroy the player." Elliot sprinted to the closet, the player's hum becoming a roar. He lifted the knife to destroy it, but hesitated. The power light pulsed slow, like a heartbeat. If it was crushed, would the tape cease, or would he forever be stuck, as was the other Elliot? He came down, his eyes spilling tears. The phone beeped, too late. He didn't glance. The TV powered up, images of static, then his face, live, gazing back. His image spoke silent words. He staggered backward, tripping over the candelabras. The air rippled, and the distorted woman was there, not on screen but in real space. She stretched out a trembling, ice-cold hand towards him. Elliot slashed with the blade, but it cut through her, harmlessly. She screamed, a crackle of glass, and was gone. The humming player stopped, but silence was unbearable. Elliot sat in blackness, player silent, knife by his side. The apartment was a labyrinth of lines now, glowing faintly, charting a reality from which he could not escape. The blurred woman's cackling still echoed in his head, a blemish. The tapes revealed his future, and it was here, despair, loneliness, a shadow to engulf him. He'd not watched a new tape, but he didn't have to. The player was alive, drawing sustenance from him, and the tapes its voice. He'd attempted to escape once more, grabbed a bag, and walked to the bus stop. The streets were all wrong, vacant, buildings distorted, windows that seemed like eyes. The phone, now useless, displayed only static. He'd gone back, the apartment dragging him in as if by force of gravity. The player rested in the living room now, its cords folded in snake fashion. There was a new tape on the table, its case labeled with a single spiral. He'd yet to touch it, but he was certain it was the final. Marcus's notebook was his only reference. Break the player, it instructed, but the ceremony had gone awry, binding him more strongly. He reread the entries, uncovering a hidden page he'd overlooked. L. Marrow, 1987, constructed the conduit. Use blood to secure it. Destroy the anchor, not the device. Elliot's palm ached, the cut still open. It was his blood that had powered up the player, bonded him to the tapes. If he was to destroy it, then he'd have to reverse the bond. but his notebook said nothing about that. He relit the candles, their flames faint, and sat in the symbol circle. The air was heavy, the walls throbbing. He whispered, "I'm not yours," in hope that intent alone. The player whirred, quietly at first, then louder, a chant in a language foreign to him. The TV glowed, flashing to the basement from the previous tape, but vacant, the tapes missing. The other Elliot, aged and battered, held a blade to his wrist. He glared at the camera, at Elliot, and spoke, "It's you or them." He cut deep, blood accumulating, and the screen blackened. Elliot comprehended. The anchor was his blood, his existence. To destroy the player, he'd have to bleed to death, as in the case of that other Elliot. He clutched the blade, its shiny surface reflecting the light of Theurgia's candle. The blurred woman manifested, not upon the screen but beside it, her void eyes sparkling. She spoke in a low whisper, "Do it." The shadow from the woods towered over her, its static eyes locked upon him. They craved his offering, his defeat. He raised his blade, his arm steady. The cymbals pulsed more brightly, the whine a deafening roar. But a memory came to mind, Marcus, laughing about rewiring antique electronics, telling him, "Change the circuit, change the game." Elliot let go of the blade, reaching for the player. He ripped it open, laying bare its insides, copper wire, metal circuits, a beating red light like a heart. The woman let out a scream, the shadow attacked, but he pulled the light loose, its glow dying in his grasp. The hum ceased. The symbols faded. The shadow woman disappeared, the air dissipating. The TV was blank, only static. Elliot crumpled, pieces of the player all over. The tapes remained, but their cases felt vacant, not breathing. He torched them in the sink, the plastic dissolving, his eyes watering. The new tape, with its spiral markings, refused to burn. He hid it in a drawer, swearing he'd never watch. Days went by. The apartment was back to normal, symbols erased, walls scrubbed. Elliot returned to his job, avoiding Tyrese's glares. He phoned Marcus's number each day, but it was no longer in service. The thrift store reopened, its old shopkeeper restored, with no memory of the player. Elliot didn't press. He wished to forget, to recreate. And at night he could hear it, a low hum, not from his closet but from within. His healed palm hurt in his dreams. The basement loomed in his dreams, tapes stacked to the ceiling, the other Elliot whispering, "You didn't finish." He woke up in a sweat, reaching for the drawer. The spiral tape was always in place, unplayed, but getting increasingly heavy. One evening, he couldn't help but give in. He retrieved his old television, plugged it in, and slipped in the tape. The screen reflected his apartment, now alive. He was in the circle, knife to his hand, the woman and shadow at his back. The other Elliot emerged, smiling. "You're us now," he said. The tape didn't stop. It looped, with him watching, then viewing himself watch, a spiral of futures imploding into one. Elliot did not scream. He didn't struggle. He sat, the blade icy, the vibration in his vertebrae. The player disappeared, but the tapes survived. His future was not dark, it was infinite, a loop that was continuous,